There used to be an old butcher shop down the street from my grandparents' house. It was about a few houses down, but it was unmistakable. An old concrete building adorned with old logos for Pepsi, Coke, and blurbs about the special meats they had on sale. Ribeyes only $9, strip steaks for only $12, all emboldened in a tacky comic font that harkened back to a time long gone. I only ever had been in the building a few times, but I can remember some details of the interior. It had an old country store vibe, shelves filled with old candies and other assortments, various canned goods and breads from different brands. But if you went into this store, you primarily came for the cheap cold cuts, and I distinctly remember this big metal meat freezer right next to the counter. It scared me a little as a kid, thinking what could end up being in there. The shop was owned by an old butcher and his wife. They were a sweet old couple, the kind you'd see going to church every Sunday. They both wore glasses, and the butcher always had his apron on ready to go. I can't remember a time when the old man didn't have it on. He was always behind that counter every single day. If it were Sunday, he'd open at 1, and he'd always close the store at 5. His wife was the cashier. She'd sit up at the counter taking the money while he was always cutting and tenderizing behind the meat counter. They were open for quite some time. Locals considered it a hidden gem when it came to getting delicious meats for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Then one day in 2011, the shop closed. I remember the day I found out. I was going with my grandfather to the shop. He had wanted to make steaks that day, and the butcher's shop was where he would normally get his cuts from. We went in his old pickup down the street, hopped out onto the old gravel parking lot, and walked up to the door. On the door was a chain lock and a sign, "Sorry, we're closed." That was strange considering that it was 2:30 when we arrived. They were never closed that early. Disappointed, my grandfather told me to hop back in the truck, and we went to the supermarket down the road from the neighborhood. Over time, more and more people came by the store to check if it was open, to no avail. The sign remained in the same position that we saw the day we went. It was disappointing to everyone in the neighborhood, considering the only place anyone could find cheap cold cuts was closed seemingly indefinitely. And what was even stranger than the fact the couple closed the shop abruptly was the fact that no one seemed to have seen the couple after that. They stopped showing up to church. You'd never see them come out of their house. Some rumored them to have died, yet nothing close to their names ever appeared in the paper in the obituary section. No one knew if they had any other family, so no one thought to do a wellness check. It's like they had vanished off the face of the earth. Over time, everyone seemed to have forgotten the place. Sure, you could see the store while passing by on the street, or catch a glimpse when you drove by, but there was no sign of activity inside or outside the store. The old signs gradually faded out over the years due to weather and other factors. There were always rumblings of some real estate company or local business owner wanting to buy the building, but nothing ever came of it. So like many old buildings in our town, it became a nostalgic reminder of a time gone by. That is, until one summer a few years back. You see, like many old buildings in the area, graffiti artists started to use the old building as a place to practice their art, much to the chagrin of the locals, who preferred the building stay stuck in its time. So out of respect for the old couple and their legacy, local community organizers would come and repaint the walls from time to time. It wasn't a lot of work at first, but then the tags started to appear more frequently. I can even remember some of the ones that were found on the side of the building. JJ, Robo, Felspon. That one always stuck out to me. The place was always considered to be a simple, peaceful little grocery store, so for it to have such a phrase tagged onto it was ironic. Due to the frequency of the vandalism, they decided to have some members of the neighborhood form a watch to help stave off any potential vandals. I was one of the volunteers who would paint the walls since I was on break from school and staying with my grandparents. The routine we had going was this: at night the watch would patrol the area, while the rest of us would come to clean up any mess during the day. It worked for a few days, but towards the end of the week, some of our night members started to not show up. We tried calling their houses to no avail, so eventually, we just circled to clean up whatever mess happened overnight and called it good. Then we started noticing the smell. It wasn't as pungent at first, but then throughout the summer it got worse by the day. We tried tracking the source of the smell, but found absolutely nothing indicating that it was occurring outside. Then one of the volunteers suggested maybe the smell was occurring inside the building. None of us truly wanted to go inside since it was an old building, and God only knew what was rotting inside there. It was an old butcher block after all. but we decided that it might take some time for the sanitation department to come out, and if the smell got stronger the neighbors would complain. So we bucked up and broke in. It wasn't too hard since one of the more handy volunteers had some bolt cutters in their truck, so we snapped the chain lock and headed inside. "Oh yeah, it's definitely in here," one of the guys shouted. The first thing that seemed off to us was that the place looked like a tornado had gone through it. Shelves once neatly organized and labeled were all over the place, with cans and various other assortments adorning the now yellowed and dirtied floor. The meat counter was empty and the smell in the air was almost unbearable. The freezer next to the door was bolted shut. The lock itself was strangely new, almost like it was bought yesterday. I noticed that there was a door that was open ajar near the counter. I figured it might have been an office of some kind, so I opened it cautiously and saw an old metal desk with what looked to be an old CRT and a VHS player on top of it. This must have been the security system, I thought. Considering the old couple were not the most tech-savvy people in the community, it made sense that their security system still ran on tape. I figured that maybe the tapes would shed some light on what happened to them, so while the others were exploring the store, I sat down and tried to get the security system to turn on. It took a few tries, but after some finagling, I heard the distinct sound of static coming to life and was greeted by a blank picture. VHS tapes littered the table, each with a label denoting the day of filming. I took a look at each one until one caught my eye. 6/3/11. That was the day before the store closed. I popped the tape into the player and hit play. June 3rd, 2011, 5 p.m. The video showed a few different angles of the store. One view was of the checkout counter, two of the aisles of the store, and then the last of the meat counter and freezer. The old man sat behind his counter, working on cutting some ribs down to wash. The wife was busy tallying up the money they had received from the business day. It looked like a completely normal day for the two. That was until I noticed the meat freezer slowly opening. I wasn't the only one who noticed, as in the video the old man had stepped out and saw the same. He slowly walked towards the door and opened it. What happens next is hard to describe. He starts to yell, apparently frightened at what he sees. This then alerts his wife, who runs out from behind the cash register towards the door to the fridge. Once she reaches the door where her husband is standing, she looks as well and joins in the screaming. They both are screaming so loud that the audio, already garbled by the age of the equipment, starts to clip. I watch as on the screen, the old couple gets engulfed by something. I could tell it wasn't human, nor was it an animal. It looked almost like it could have been a smudge on the screen. They continued to scream, as whatever the thing was pulled them into the darkness of the meat freezer, and once pulled in, the door slammed shut. My face went pale. The scene was quiet for about 10 minutes, then the door opened again, and a mass of long black tendrils shot across the floor, knocking over the shelves. One shot over the meat counter, and wrapped around the butcher knife the old man was using to cut the ribs. Then the tendrils receded into the freezer. All the while, horrified screams could be heard from the darkness. I fast-forwarded the tape hoping to catch another glimpse of whatever creature that was inside the freezer, but after that moment, there were no sounds, no screams, nothing at all. Then I heard the clink of chains being dropped to the floor. I bolted out of the office, screaming at the others, "Don't open the door." But it was too late. The door slowly crept open, but no creature emerged. But that smell, it smelled like the stench of death. On the floor, partially illuminated by the sunlight creeping in, were several boxes of old beef, chicken, and pork, all moldy from the passage of time. Flies and other insects buzzed about. But that wasn't even the worst thing we found. One of the volunteers shined a flashlight inside the freezer. The walls were caked in blood. I wasn't sure if it was human, animal, or something else. Hanging from the meat hooks were different bags, each filled with processed and tenderized corpses, human corpses, and 3 were fresh. We bolted out of the building and immediately called 911 and screamed for the cops to come. In the end, 7 different bodies were carried out of the butcher shop that day. 2 were identified as the owners of the store, while the other 5 were volunteers from the night watch. The store was demolished shortly after that, and a candlelight vigil was held for the lives that were lost. I was never the same after seeing that tape, knowing that I was the only one who saw what happened to those 2, and knowing that what happened to them likely happened to our volunteers. I didn't go to my grandparents for some time after that, until they eventually moved away from that neighborhood. After some years of consultation with therapists, I ended up returning to that neighborhood recently. I met up with one of the neighborhood kids who had been a playmate of mine. Trauma never really goes away, and you can kind of see that when you drive through the neighborhood now. Most of the houses close to the site of the tragedy are now abandoned, although there are still some, like my old buddy, who still call it their home. I asked him about the demolition and how the community felt when the place finally came down. He took a little bit of time to think before he answered. "You know, it's really weird," he explained. "They bulldozed the place quickly after word got around about what happened. Before they did though, the police checked the place out one last time. For whatever reason, they found wrapped cold cuts sitting on the meat counter." He paused for a moment. "They were fresh,